to there we go. We're going to find this picture useful because today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be having a think as we do more landscapes about how to distinguish between our foreground and our background. Because when we paint, well, when we see something with our eyes, we can focus on what's immediately before us, and it'll catch our eye more than the background because our eyes will focus on it. But when we're painting a picture, we can't give that same difference of focus. So we have to draw out the foreground in other ways. And so what we're going to be doing in order to do that is we're going to try using stronger, more vibrant colors and bigger contrasts, bigger color contrasts for elements in the foreground than those in the background. And I've picked this picture for two reasons. The first is I think it's a very lovely image, and that the second is that the distinction between foreground and background could hardly be made more plain here. We've got this background of rolling hills sweeping into a blue horizon. Aha. Hi, Cliff. Are you here for the watercolor?
Yes, that's right.
I'm not sure. You haven't been part of our earlier sessions?
No, that's right. I did the course before with Doris, but I wasn't able to do the earlier session.
Okay, so if you've got some knowledge, so would you like to join in this time? Have you got paints and things with you?
Yeah, I've got everything I need.
Okay, oh grand. Well, I was just saying, have you been sent the photos then? Because we're using this one today.
Yes, I've got.
Ah, fantastic. Thank you. Okay.
I'm all set.
Lovely. Well, welcome. I was just telling the others that what we're thinking about today is distinguishing between foreground and background when we're painting landscapes. And that's the reason I've picked this picture of Corfe Castle, well, of a bit of Corfe Castle, is that we've got a very clear distinction between what's in the foreground and what's in the background. We've got a background that's sweeping away into the horizon here. We've got a whacking great bit of castle stuck in the middle of the frame. So we can have a play with that. We can have a play as well with the background that we can see through that narrow sort of arrow window there. And we can see what effects we'll get. So I'm just going to pop my camera down now. There we go. And before we begin, I'd like us to just bear in mind the elements, the different bits of color and how they fit together and how we're going to translate that onto the page. We've got this slab of wall, haven't we? And it's what I'd like to notice is that it's very long and narrow. I think sometimes when we paint an object in the middle of a frame, we do tend to bulk it out a bit and maybe not make it as elongated as it is. So it's a very long, narrow shape, bang in the middle, fairly thin, and either side it's got on one side this protuberance of stone, and on the other side this this foliage, and then we've got a horizon that cuts in, I'd say around a quarter, maybe a little higher than a quarter of the way from the bottom of our frame. So bearing all that in mind, those who've been with me before know that nothing scares me more than a blank canvas, so I'd like to get right into it and start painting our sky. And for that we're going to need our great big decorator's brush. Cliff, have you been sent these brushes?
I've got a set of brushes.
Oh, fantastic. So what I'm using here, fantastic. What I'm using here is just a 3/4 inch flat brush. So if you've got something similar to this, nice large brush for washes and the like, that's what we're going to be doing a lot of our work with today. Okay. So now we're going to be using a wet on wet for our sky, and before we continue, I think I might just chuck a couple of pieces of masking tape down. You're welcome to do the same, but of course it's not obligatory, it's just something I like to do. And when we're doing our sky, it would be nice to make sure that we don't need to overpaint too much when we come to do our bit of ruined wall, but at the same time, there's no harm in it. So if we do end up going a bit over the lines, that's okay. But broadly speaking, I'd like to just paint in a sky, one half here, joined just at the very top here, and leaving a nice little gap for our bit of wall, for our whacking great foreground. So, decorator's barn painter in hand. I'm just going to wake that up with some water. And then you'll remember from our wet and wet, we just want to paint our paper with water. And we don't want there to be a film. We don't want a visible sort of film of droplets clinging to our paper. We want the grain of the paper to still be visible when we look at it, visible beneath the water. So to do that, you can take your paper and tilt it to get a view of it through the light, or if, like me, you've stuck it down with tape, you can get down nice and low and sort of look at it from a very oblique angle just to check where the water is and just to check how much you've got. And we're going to want to be fairly speedy here because we don't want too much water there, so it will dry out if we let it holiday for too long on the paper. So we'll just lay it down roughly where we'd like it. And then once we've done that, we're just going to start getting together our sky color. For our sky, I'm going to start with the color in your palettes that's called marine blue, this fella here. But I'm going to pop some in my palette because I think marine blue is a little fierce, isn't it? And it's a cloudy day over Corfe Castle today. So working that paint really into the belly of the bristles here in our pan. I'm going to chuck some in a palette. Rinse my brush off. And then I want to give it that slight sort of overcast muddiness. So I think first things first, I'm going to chuck in a touch of violet. Not very much, mind. I'm just going to whiz a little bit in there just to get it that little bit more overcast. And then I think a bit of yellow ochre, which sounds weird, putting a rocky, earthy tint in, but I think it gives it that nice, slightly cloudy edge. And then once we've got that, we're just going to load it up fairly dilute onto our brush. And then we're just going to twist our brush across the sky like this. It probably looks like you're doing murder to the bristles, but do not worry. These brushes are stout things. They've seen worse, I'm sure. And we're just going to start laying down some of this slightly overcast storminess onto our paper, leaving gaps for clouds and putting points that are slightly more concentrated that can be our little gaps where the blue of the sky is visible. I'm just going to have some fun creating some slight differences in texture there. I'm going to try to run right up to the edge of my, of my bit of wall here. Because of course, easier to overpaint if we need to than to find ourselves obliged to paint more sky once this stuff has already settled. And so once we've got some of that down, we might just want to chuck a little bit more in some concentrated places, especially down further towards the horizon, because we can see that further towards the horizon, we get sort of more concentrated clouds. We have some gaps in the cloud cover, not very many. Very cloudy day down in Dorset when this was taken. But we can just add some in there. And then for the next bit of shadowing on those clouds, we're going to do some work on the belly of those clouds. Again, being nice and speedy. And I'm going to do the same sort of color combination. Marine blue, yellow ochre, dash of violet, but maybe also just a touch of russet brown in there as well, because these earth tones, when they get chatting with our sky colors, make for very good storm clouds. So just a dash of my russet brown in there. And I'm just going to look at how the clouds fall here, at how those whiter bits have these dark colored undersides. And I'm just going to have a play again with a brush that I'm lifting off the paper regularly and just going to have a go with that to get that slightly sort of stormy underside to some of these clouds. And then when we've done that, we can just use a brush that's wet, but really just got water on it, but maybe tap out some of the excess moisture and just harry some of those sharp edges. If you have any sharp edges like me, we can just blur them a bit, make them a bit cloudier. Blur them especially on the top, because it's where these stormy bottoms fade into the white of the clouds that we've got that really sort of fine effect, that really gentle gradient that we want to get. Again, not worrying too much about being precise, about being academically perfect. We want to get the sense of that sky through, is what we want to create. Just soften out any hard edges. I hope it shows through on mine, because I look at my webcam and it just looks as if my paper's vaguely dirty. I hope you can see that we're getting this sort of sky texture through. I'll just wait a moment just so that we're happy with our skies. It's best not to go over stuff that's had a chance to dry, because then you start churning up the paper, you start getting blooms and things, you get all these ugly effects that we want to avoid. So nice if we can be happy with our sky first time. Add more sky if we need to, but we don't really want to be obliged to touch up stuff that we've already done. I'll just wait a moment there just so that we're happy, and then we'll carry on. So if we're all ready, and do let me know if you'd like a bit more time or if you have any questions. We're just going to have a think now about the star of the show here, which is, of course, this whacking great bit of stone wall. And you'll remember that I'm always banging on about how we want to work with our lightest colors first. And so I'd like to work with this very sort of pale, like a sort of gray, but with notes of blue and almost of a sort of stony brown in it that we've got on some of these lighter stones here. And so I'd like to just establish some of that color now, in the same way, in the same sort of way that we've been doing with our 3/4 inch brush, nice and speedy. And so to get that down, I think I'd like to start off, there we go, start off with just a little bit of yellow ochre in my palette. Yellow ochre with just a dash of this russet brown again. And then, because this is our base layer on which we want to work, on which we want to add things, I'm just going to add a little bit of white, or quite a lot of white. I'm going to want to get a sort of light brown that's sort of the color of a McVitie's digestive, I think is my target. Or maybe a bit lighter still. With that nice light stony feel to it. And then again, it's fairly dilute. And so holding the brush fairly high up, we want to use some nice confident strokes just to start laying down the shape of our bit of broken wall in the foreground. There we go, we can use the side of the brush like that, just to get that top. And we're working in a nice sort of undercoat here, so we don't need to worry too much. Just good to get that shape in. Nice to have a structure down. We can get that nice sort of craggy shape of the ruined sort of stone wall there with the side of our brush. Again, I'm going to steal paint from areas that are thick with it, and give it to areas that are not. Steal from the rich, give to the poor, get a nice quick dry wash down. And as I go onto this side, of course, I'm just going to be mindful that we want our window, so I'm going to draw that out first to make sure I don't accidentally run him over. And once I've drawn that out, again with this fairly dilute color, I'm just going to get this zigzag wall in. And then just fill that in with a nice wash. I said before that, of course, we take our pictures as guides. We can take the odd liberty, invoke our artistic license. And it looks like I'm pushing my horizon a little further down, focusing a little bit more on the foreground in my framing. And something like that's all right. And now what I'd like to do, now that we've done this, is start thinking about how we're going to add some interest, how we're going to build up some different shades on this stone and get that nice texture. And I think that the first thing I notice that I really like is this broken cross section that we get of wall. I think that really draws the eye, doesn't it? Because it's this spatter of dark contrast that sort of shouldn't be there when we first look at this picture, and it's sat right up there. And I like the fact that we can see it's a slightly different consistency as this mortar or some medieval equivalent that we've got here, and then we've got the dark stones jutting through it. I really like that contrast. And so I think we can get that sort of sandy mortar color. We can create something like that. We can, again, splash some down here and then really start to build up the look of this foreground. So for that, I think it's going to be a similar sort of combination to what we just did for our sort of wall base layer. But I think I'd like to add a little bit more yellow ochre, and maybe a little less white. The important thing to bear in mind is that here we're starting to think about the fact that we want to emphasize the foreground. And although it might be quite a washed out color in our picture, I am very happy to cheat slightly and to make the foreground pop a little bit more, just so that we can use a bright, vivid foreground and a relatively washed out, muted background to really draw our attention to the subject in this picture. I'm still going to use a little bit of white, but not as much as we did before. And now we're loading this color up into the belly of our brush. I'm just going to draw with it. Just going to have a look at how that cross section looks and what its edges are like. I'm just going to draw in the entirety of that cross section. And when we reach a bit where the wall juts out, it sort of juts with it, doesn't it? Just like that. So I'm just going to follow that. And then we sort of break off there. There we go. I'll just even that out a little bit. I like this color so much, I think I want to use it elsewhere. I want to use it to create a bit more interest. And like I've said before, we use our pictures as guidance, but we don't have to strictly adhere to what we see. So I like the effect that we get from different patches of stone, from the lichen and things, the different tones of stone that we get, particularly here. Up here we've got our lichen on the bricks and things, and that's something maybe to work with a little bit more specifically, but we've got these larger areas of different colors here, and so I think I want to introduce something like that over here. Again, just looking at the way that these things sit on the stone, not worrying too much about specifics. I just want to introduce some, just alter the look ever so slightly. Maybe I'll add a few little horizontal dashes like that with my brush, as we can see sort of mortar and things peeking through, catching our attention near the edges. And now I think I'd like to wait for a bit, because we've got our areas of interest down. We've got these different colors, but we want quite a sort of fine texture when we work on this wall. So I'm just going to let that color settle for a little bit. And I think, again, just working with what we've been doing and just throwing in these blocks of color so we know what we're working with, I'd like to just add in, again, a nice base for this foliage that we're going to have. So for that, I think I'm going to use some leaf green, maybe muddled in with a bit of ochre, a bit of yellow ochre. Get that bright color on which we're going to overpaint with some darker colors. The color of the leaves, the highlights catching the sun there. Catching the sun, he says, on this very, very cloudy photograph. There's a sun somewhere.
You're using a green there. I'm sorry, I missed that little bit, Felix. Are you using a green?
That's right. Yes. So this is I'm using leaf green.
Leaf green.
I'm going to. That's right. I'm just going to chuck in a little bit of yellow ochre as well, just because I think leaf green is this vivid sort of chartreuse, isn't it? And we want to just get it. It's a little bit yellower and it's a little bit more calm in our picture. So just to make sure that our foliage doesn't look too extraterrestrial, I'm just going to dampen it with a little bit of yellow ochre. And then I'm just going to chuck on. Maybe that's a bit too much yellow ochre. Maybe I'll chuck in a bit more leaf green there. I'm just going to introduce that as well, just up the walls that we have here. And this is just something with which we want to work later on, so we don't have to be terribly specific. I do this partially because I think there's a great benefit to be able to see what all our elements are, get a sense of the picture as a whole so that we can then create that detail. I'm just going to shove that pigment in towards these spots of shadow where we're going to add darker color later on. Shove that in towards the walls, these nooks and crannies that seem to attract shadow. And having done that, I think I'd like to work a little bit more with the stone of our wall itself. I mentioned this contrast, didn't I? This contrast that we get from the shadow cast by the rough slates and stones here. And I think we can start working with that now. I think we can take some russet brown on our brush. And we can use sort of short lateral sort of chopping strokes on top of our watercolor, working from the top down, just to suggest that shadow where it's cast. Oh dear, that's a bit too much. If, like me, perhaps your mortar isn't quite dry, it might be an idea to do something else first. Apologies. In which case, while we wait for that to settle, just so that we can do some relatively wet on dry to get that effect, we can turn our attention to our horizon. And for our horizon, we can notice that at the top here, we've got the blue of these hills, haven't we? But the blue isn't like the sky blue, because these hills, were we right next to them, would be green. They've acquired that blue by virtue of their distance from us. So what we want to do is we want to get that blue ridge, but we want to get a nice transition into the darker greens as the landscape comes closer towards us. To that end, I'm going to want to start off with a blue, but I'm going to want to soften it a little bit. I'm going to want to start off with some marine blue. It's ironic, isn't it, that I'm telling you to use marine blue, it seems, for just about everything in this picture apart from sea. Use marine blue for the wooded hills and the sky in this painting, which has nothing to do with anything maritime, but there we go. Bit of marine blue. And I think a bit of forest green as well. Not as much forest green as we have marine blue, but just a dash, just to ground that blue in the green hills from where it comes. And this is the very extremity of our background. So we're going to want to paint with a very dilute color. And we're going to want to maybe even take some, take some paint off if we find we have too much. So we just use these little lateral strokes like that. And we can follow our horizon along. We can peer in on it through this window here for our convenience. And then follow it across that invisible line behind our Whacking Great Castle wall. And then finish it off here. These short, gentle strokes. And now I'd just like to take that same color that we've got on our palette. I'd like to really heap it in with a bit of yellow ochre, which will just get us a really nice sort of foresty green that we can add a little bit of forest green to in addition, just for those faraway hills that blend with the blue hills of the very back of our horizon. And so as we're going wet on wet, our watercolor is going to get a bit sociable, but that's no bad thing, because I quite like the effect that produces when these two marry together. And if our green gets a bit too sociable, we can draw it back a little bit. We can get that nice fade in and leave some space for those meadows there. And because we want our background to be paler maybe than it would be in reality, I'm going to want to take a bit of tissue and just dab some of that color out. Just gently make sure we've got a nice, even but fairly muted color in our background there. And then do the same as we go across, interacting a little bit with that blue of the horizon, getting that nice gradient across. And then the same over here. And just using these slight wiggles just to suggest the gaps where we're going to add some fields. And as we get closer to the viewer, of course, our fields are going to lose that sort of bluish dimension, and they're going to get more confident, they're going to get more green. So to that end, I'd like to add in just a little bit of emerald green, just to give this bluish sort of green just a little bit more color as we pull our horizon into our middle ground. Just to give that green a little bit more kick, making it shrug off the blue of the distant horizon, and leaving these gaps where we can add in these fields here. Now with any luck, having brought that horizon down a little bit, our mortar will have had a chance to dry, and so with a bit of russet brown we can use these forwards and back chopping strokes, brush held fairly high up, and just give the suggestion of the shadows cast by the slates. I quite like these lines in that we get, these gaps and cracks. So I might invent one up here. I think they give our wall a bit of character. Again, you'll see I'm just nicking colour from parts where there's a little too much. And I'm going to do the same with these lateral flat strokes of russet, just on the side here, just to give a bit more definition to this little ruined edge of our wall over on the right hand side. These little flicks, and then muddling down from them, suggesting shadows cast underneath flat stones like that.
Shit.
Maybe just a little bit up here as well. Again, not entirely faithful to the reality of this picture, but we want our background to really stand out. And this is a nice way of just adding in a little bit of contrast against that pale, washed out sky. Adding that little bit of dark color here. Very faint. And just, again, suggesting the pattern of those bricks, but not going into them in any great detail. We can just throw that into quite a dramatic relief. Those of you who were here for last week's class will remember I said I wanted a long, fancy German word for the moment when a picture stops feeling quite just like a series of blotches of color on a page and starts feeling like a representation of the subject. And so I spoke to a friend of mine who's training to be a German translator, and he very kindly invented one for me. He said that we can call that the Kunstoffensprungsmoment. So I reckon, I don't know about you, but when we add this shadow in, when we add this shadow into our subject, we hit the Kunstoffensprungsmoment of our picture, and it starts, we can start to see our stone wall take shape. I'm going to do a final bit of work just with this brush. I think I'd like to add in some lawns right at the bottom of our horizon. Again, you'll see part of my horizon seems to be a bit chopped off, but I don't mind that because I want the focus to be on my, maybe I'll add a bit of ochre to that. I want the focus to be on my bit of ruined wall. And so now once we've done that, we can set aside our great big decorator's 3/4 inch brush for the time being. And we can start having a think about what we can do with this foundation and how we can add in the detail to really bring it further to life. So there are a couple of areas where I think we can add detail. The biggest, of course, is on the texture of our stone itself. I can see some wonderful opportunities for dry brush work here. We've got things like the lichen and the texture of the cragged stone, the uneven texture of the brickwork here, all of that. We can use a dry brush and a darker color paint to really bring that out. And we can attack some of the wall over here with some ochre and spatter in some lichen like we've got there. But we can also do more work with our foliage. We can add in darker colors to the forest in the background and indeed give some detail to the foliage that we have in the foreground. So to that end, I am going to swap my big decorator's brush for a slightly smaller, medium-sized brush. This is my size 8 that I'm using, but anything similar in size to this will do just fine. And I'm going to begin by adding a bit of shadow just above and below our notch window here. I like getting these dark shadows in because they give an immediate sense of what we're working with, what our picture is going to look like, and we can use them as the framework on which we build our detail, the devil being in the detail. And so fairly wet on dry, I want to create a fairly sharp shadow shape, just running along the top here. Very gentle.
Are you using
oh, sorry, yes, I'm using russet brown for this. Again, nice to get that clear, defined wet on dry, because this is something that we want to be a sharp shadow. This is a real focal point, these two dark slits in the picture. I think they really draw the eye very nicely, and they'll really bring this into 3 dimensions. There's a second slightly lighter shadow here, isn't there? Falling into two notches on either side that are a little darker than the surrounding space. So we can chuck some more pigment there if we need to do so. Having done that, I just want to try adding in some of these marvelous bits of texture that we have over here. I'd like to try adding in, for example, some darker mix of maybe russet brown and our burnt sienna, just to get in some of these sort of scratchy lichen tones that we've got here. I'm going to take the opportunity just to clean my palette. And then I'm going to want to mix a fairly thick mixture of this russet brown and burnt sienna. We want to get that nice, slightly scratchy sort of texture. And remember, control the moisture on your brush with a bit of kitchen towel. We can make sure that we can mix up this paint without letting it get too dilute. Get that nice brick red, of the burnt sienna, gives a bit of warmth to our russet brown. And you may want to test it out. Test it out on a bit of scrap paper, because although nothing is permanent in watercolor, it's a little harder to erase our darker colors than our light. And then once we've jettisoned a bit of moisture maybe onto a bit of paper, we can just start to suggest some of this dark coloring. Getting that nice scratchy edge to it. I'm going to want to give a nice dark outline to the very edge of my arrow window here.
Hello? Can I ask you to phone me back, please, if possible? Thank you. Later on, please. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Bye.
I might like to use some of this colour just to highlight the shadow underneath some stepped bits of stone that we have over here. I quite like that. Quite like to be able to emphasize that. And I'm just going to, while I've got my medium brush in hand, just fill in some of these gaps here with these fields and have a think about how we're going to texture some of those trees. I think we can use some just slightly lightened yellow ochre for that. Again, we don't want to paint too much detail on the background because detail draws attention to itself, which is something we don't want the background to do. And we can then, once we've done that, we can overpaint on these areas of darker green in our background just to get that forested texture. You can do that with a nice darker green. So we can take some fairly thick olive drab and we can dot some in where we see the base of those, the base of these trees. It becomes a little darker in a sort of pattern, and that way we can suggest foliage. Again, we want to get this olive drab fairly thick so we can be fairly controlled. And like we did stippling for our foliage, we can just run the brush round in these gentle little half loops, just to get the slightly serried edge of our trees there. Perspective, of course, we want our trees to get smaller as we get towards the horizon, and so the gaps between these great waves will diminish a little bit. Sounds very obvious, but I think it is easy to forget if we're not careful. Then we're working less distinctly and with less colour the further towards the background we go. And we can bring our pigment up, and just like we did with our gradients, whenever we do those, we can with a brush that's been wet, we can just blur out those edges a little bit. So I'm going to take a brush loaded with nothing but water, and then just dry it a little bit with a few strokes on tissue or kitchen paper. I'm just going to harry that edge a little bit and just blend that in nicely, give the three-dimensional effect of a great big friendly spherical tree, just so that that ruffled edge is just catching the light. Just shove that pigment around a little bit. Can, even if we want, drop in a few dashes of something like burnt sienna. Muddle it in a little bit, just to give that variety of colour that we have. Again, just muddling that in with a dry brush, or a brush that's loaded with water, but not very much, I should say. And I'm going to do something similar as I work across. Have these plain fields of crops, and then these slightly ruffled, slightly more interesting bits of trees. Working again with my olive drab to create these almost like these undulating waves of shadows overlapping one another that I can then tease out and harry out with a brush that's loaded with a very little bit of water. Again, we've got a nice little driveway down there, but it's up to you. I think I'm gonna lie and pretend that that doesn't exist. I think I want to just have a nice line of trees. Bit disappointing to have a reminder of modern civilization when we're doing a picture of a picturesque ruin like this. In the same way that you may have spotted the rather ugly little floodlight just in the bottom right hand side of the corner. I don't know about you, but I don't feel any obligation to paint that. I think we can get away with not giving that too much attention. Once we've done that, and once we're happy that we've got a nice, suitably gentle background in, something that's not going to steal too much limelight from our bit of wall, we can start concentrating on the said wall a bit more now that the colours have had a chance to settle. Because of course I'd just like to have a look at the colour of it. It looks a whole lot darker than we've got it here because of course we've still just got our base coat down with a few guiding shadows. So what I'd really like to do is to get in and give that darker color that the stone has. But what we can do is we can use this lighter base shade that we've got to let the lichen that's spattering these bricks really show through, really shine through. I'm going to mix up a nice color to that end. And I think that what we've got here, if you still have it in your palette, will work quite nicely to begin with. It's our mixture of russet brown and burnt sienna. I really like the warmth that that's got, so maybe I'll just add a bit more into that. And maybe, just for luck, I'll put a bit of ochre in, yellow ochre in as well. You also detect something of the gloominess of the sky in this color that most of the stone is. So I think I'm going to add in a little bit of violet as well. Just send that into the mix. And then with this colour now, I'd just like to start working along, wet on dry, and just painting in, and we can paint around these fine, brighter areas. We can paint around them, going back and using a finer brush if we like, just to get that very dappled, very different texture that our wall has. We'll find that this will give it a nice contrast, a very nice contrast indeed with the sky behind it. Paying attention, of course, to the perspective, which has these bricks sort of all slanting down, doesn't it? You see I'm leaving these gaps here, these little gaps where the lichen spatters the stone very gently. Then I'm just going to work my way down from top to bottom with this, working with the point of the brush as little pressure as I can manage, and just creatively just adding in those brick-shaped gaps where we get bricks that have lichen on them.
Felix?
Yes.
I'm very sorry I have to leave now. I've got another meeting at 11 o'clock.
Okay, that's absolutely fine. Thanks for letting me know, Cliff. This will be on YouTube, so you're welcome to catch up.
So
Thank you.
finish it off.
Yes, thank you very much for joining.
Oh, I enjoyed it immensely. And as I understand it, there's no class next week, but there's one the week after. Is that right?
Absolutely right. Yes. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Take care.
I will do. Thank you very much,
Thanks.
Felix. Really, really enjoyable.
Fantastic. Thanks. Take care. I'm always doing my Robin Hood act here of stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, just making sure we get a nice even tone. I always think lichen looks like alien life or something when I see it up close. It's meant to be an indicator of good air quality, isn't it? But when you see them looking like weird alien trees, like broccoli gone wrong in all sorts of shades of off-white and yellow, it just looks very spooky. I can remember being very spooked by it when I was little. But happily for us, it makes our buildings look very picturesque. Of course, the angle at which these bits of lichen follow the brickwork gently sort of decreases, doesn't it? As we bear in mind our perspective. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that same color, but sort of in reverse for some other areas of our picture. Areas like these, where for whatever reason there's not as much lichen growing. Maybe this bit of wall is, I don't know, north facing, or maybe it's facing a massive power station that's polluting the air and making it not attractive real estate for lichen. But whatever the reason, there's not as much lichen here, is there? But we have that nice sort of brick texture. So I'm going to use this and I'm just going to sort of lay it down in, I need more color, but lay it down in a series of squares with a little bit more pigment at the bottom, just to get the suggestion there of brickwork. I'm leaving these little gaps of white here, but they will become filled with the dark color. Just leaving them there as guidelines for me more than anything else, just so that I know where I can then add my darker color to get the shadow underneath each of these stones. I'm going to carry on with this brickwork just along here and later as well, just down here. Again, we don't have to religiously get every single brick, but it's nice to just give a hint of where these stones are. We've got these patches covered with lichen above, and we can get away with using that along with some darker sort of colors for those joins to suggest brickwork. So I'm working around this patch of darker color here with my stones. Well, folks, I can see that once again time has sped on ahead of us. Now, if you're all happy with the idea, I was thinking we could continue with these and finish these pictures off next week, if that sounds good.
Yeah.
Oh, excuse me, the week after next, because I'm afraid there will not be a class next week. This is because I'm going to be visiting my parents in darkest Dorset, where the internet simply isn't good enough to run a Zoom call, but I'll be back in 2 weeks' time. Just before we end, I've been asked by Teresa to let you know that we are running a number of trips to the Barnet Fire Station in August, with the idea of doing some watercolor paintings of the station, paintings of the hoses and fire engine and equipment and things inside and out. It's a sort of outing that's going to be, there's going to be a number run in August. So if you are interested in that, if you'd like to do some painting en plein air, as it were, rather than just of pictures like we've been doing at the moment, then do let Teresa know by email and she'll let you know more about it.
Wow.
I can remind you of that again later, closer to the date. But as for now, I think all that remains is for you to show me your masterpieces in progress, if you don't mind. Oh, fantastic. I love that sky. Isn't that extraordinary? Wow. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Well, those look very splendid. I look forward to completing them with you all when we next come together. Until then, have a lovely 2 weeks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
very much.
Take
Goodbye.
care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Enjoy
Take
the
care.
break.
Thank you.